Back to our lead story on forced virginity tests in Egypt. A senior Egyptian general has admitted to CNN that its military forcibly subjected female protesters to the invasive exams following protests on March 9th, a month after President Hosni Mubarak resigned. The military calls them virginity checks. The international community considers it sexual assault and torture. Egyptian journalist Mona El-Tahawy, she is joining us from New York. She's a columnist on Arab and Muslim issues. And Mona, thank you for joining us. First of all, help us understand this. Can you explain what a virginity test is?
It's basically a way to determine whether a woman is a virgin or not, and it usually depends on whether a hymen is in place or not. That's forgetting, of course, that not all virgins have hymens in place and that some women are born without hymens. But I think what goes to the heart of what happened there in Egypt, and that we have final confirmation of, is that the state is once more sexually assaulting women in Egypt, but this time it's under the council of the Supreme Military Council, whereas in 2005 it was the state under the guise of the Mubarak regime that began to deliberately target female activists and journalists with sexual assault. And the goal of both sexual assaults from the army and from the Mubarak regime is to humiliate women, to shame them into silence, and basically tell them, go home.
Is this a common practice in Egypt?
You know, this morning I put the question out on Twitter and I asked people I know in Egypt, you know, have you guys heard of these virginity tests? And this is a common practice in conservative cultures that place a high value on women's virginity. So you will hear of conservative parts of Egypt where a traditional midwife will be in charge of showing or examining whether a bride-to-be is a virgin or not. And there are cases in which some Egyptian families have gone to medical authorities to determine whether women are virgins or not, in the way that we hear in Latin America they have, and also as recently as 1976 in the UK, where virginity tests were forced on women immigrating from India. So essentially what I'm saying is these are tests that are forced on women by a patriarchal authority to determine something as flimsy as a hymen. So it happens in Egypt, it happens in countries that are conservative, and at the end of the day it's extremely humiliating to women.
And Mona, you bring up a very good point. You talk about the fact that this was used as a form of sexual assault under the Mubarak regime, but now you have the military in charge and it's also being used in that way. What is happening in Egypt? Has there been this revolution that we've seen that has occurred that has helped women in any way in terms of improving their rights or their status in society?
You know, it's absolutely outrageous, Suzanne, because more than 800 Egyptians died and thousands were injured to get rid of Mubarak. But essentially what has happened is that we've replaced Mubarak in Egypt with a Supreme Council of Mubaraks, which is a Supreme Military Council. That same council not only sexually assaults women, but it also tortures people, it detains people, it puts hundreds of civilians in military jails and on military trials. In Egypt today, 5 journalists were called in for questioning, which was then called a chat with the military, because they dared to criticize the military. 3 judges are being questioned by the military because they spoke to the media without permission. It's absolutely outrageous.
So, Mona, for those of us who are listening to you, and many Americans in the audience who are listening, wondering, should the United States, should the Obama administration support such a regime, such a government, the people inside of Egypt? What should be done next?
Well, you know, the United States gives Egypt $1.5 billion in aid every year. $1.3 billion of that aid goes to the Egyptian military. So here's something that President Obama can do. He can pick up the phone and say, if you want to continue seeing those $1.3 billion, then let's talk about human rights violations by the Supreme Military Council, about what you're doing to Egyptian revolutionaries, about the shameful sexual assaults on Egyptian women, but more importantly about why it's absolutely imperative that Egypt, basically Egypt goes to civilian leadership and gets rid of military leadership finally. We've been under military leadership in Egypt since 1952, and military leadership is essentially a patriarch that violates everybody.
All right, Mona El-Tahawy, thank you very much for your perspective. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Mona.